to talk to you today on one of the most challenging international and European problems of our time. And thank you very much to the Center for Turkish Studies for inviting me here, and to Yvette for hosting this event. And we know she'll come afterwards and stay a bit with us. Refugee numbers present the EU and its member states certainly with a huge challenge, if not a litmus test for measuring the EU's capacity to develop a common answer. And my title here is a quote from an interview with a member of the European Commission urging the EU and its member states to do more. The EU and its member states have responded indeed to the challenge with a series of legislative and also operational initiatives. And in order to assess these instruments, I think we need to provide clear benchmarks. The compass that might show us this way should be those values and norms, I think, which the EU and its member states have explicitly given themselves in the treaties and in international law. Human dignity, human rights, refugee rights, and the principles of solidarity and shared responsibility among the member states. The EU's policies with regard to the refugee crisis may be divided into three concentric circles as I see them, from the outside inwards. On the outside, firstly, the cooperation with the countries of origin and transit, and moving further to the inside on the transit route. Secondly, the fight against irregular migration and trafficking, border management systems, etc. And in an inner circle, of course, the much debated distribution of refugees across member states, the Dublin system, and all the rights refugees and asylum seekers would have once they arrive in the member states. I will give you an example for each of these three circles and ask how these examples match the standards before mentioned, in order to arrive at three theses and recommend some actions for the future. To find solutions to the Syrian crisis in its 6th year of war is vital. We all hope that the Geneva talks beginning on Friday bring about a broad ceasefire, stop the so-called Islamic State, and increase aid. UNHCR High Commissioner Filippo Grandi stated only 2 weeks ago that, quote, while the influx to Europe has finally focused the attention of the world on the Syrian crisis and the epic levels of human suffering it produces, the biggest burden so far is shouldered by communities and governments in the region. Therefore, it is of utmost importance, of course, to support host communities. And over the last 12 months, the number of registered Syrian refugees in Turkey, Lebanon, Jordan, Iraq, and Egypt has increased by more than 1 million, bringing the overall total to almost 4.3 million. And the UNHCR expects that some 4.7 million Syrian refugees will be registered in the region by the end of this year. Donors have been very dilatory in providing funds. The so-called Regional Refugee and Resilience Plan on the UN level was only 50% funded last year. It is this shortfall which exacerbates the lack of services such as shelter, food, water, health and education, placing the host communities under an even more severe strain and causing considerable difficulties for their social cohesion. According to the UNHCR, this is the most important trigger for the large-scale movement of refugees further afield to Europe. However, the number of Syrians arriving in Europe remains low compared to Syria's neighboring countries, with slightly more than 10% of those who have fled the conflict seeking safety in Europe. And you have provided the numbers in a very informative briefing paper and report done here in the House of Commons. This is also true for the Zaatari camp in Jordan, where more than 80,000 persons are lodging in the middle of the desert, right on the Syrian border, and more than 8,000 have set out only in the last few months towards Germany. After 5 years and with deteriorating conditions, refugees in these camps are losing all hope that there will be a way back to their homeland.
Crisis, or European migration crisis, maybe we should better call it, is something we have been quite late to label and describe and name. Because we are very much aware, at least in a decade now, most of the European elections have been more or less set by migration, immigration debates. Not always a very well informed debate, but that is what we have. As my colleague Petra explained, there is still some hope in politics though. Today I will focus more on what is the demographic and a bit of the financial aspects of this crisis, and mainly looking at the cases of Syrians in Turkey, and with a bit of a reference to Germany too. So, this misinformed debate feels more like fiction than facts. Understandably, media and politics operate on different parameters than what we do as researchers and academics. I will therefore focus on facts and leave the politics to our hosts. This is what they are elected and paid for at the end of the day. On your desks, you have these little fact sheets, perhaps you have noticed. There are some bold numbers for us to remember and see what are these numbers and what refugees or migrants overall represent within the wider populations we have in the world and in Europe. As you can see, migrants and movers are, or as I prefer to call them, represent a very small fraction of the populations around the world. Out of 7.3 billion, we are looking at just less than 250 million of people who live outside their countries of birth. That is roughly about 3.3% of the world population. And don't forget, although we are very anxious about what is going on in Europe regarding immigration, 42% of those immigrants are residing in low-income countries, developing countries, less developed countries. So much of the burden lies there. I will give you some more striking figures later. You will understand that importance of that 42% is much bigger than it looks. 4.5 million Syrians are technically international displaced people. So these are the refugees we are seeing in Turkey, in Lebanon, Jordan, and Europe. 2.5 million of them are in Turkey. That is 3.1% of Turkey's total population. And only about 800,000 so far reached Europe in last 4 years, since 2011. That is 0.1% of Europe's population. So a tiny little fraction of 505 million Europe, that is, European Union, that is. Europe, if we include others, is much bigger. So out of that many, only 1 in 10 of those displaced in Syria are reaching and arriving in Europe. That is important for us to understand. Migration, particularly international migration, is a very selective process. So those who are able to leave the country at relatively earlier stages of such big conflicts are often more resourceful people with higher social capital, higher human capital, and higher risk-taking characteristics. So they are more likely to be entrepreneurial than anybody else. And obviously they have relatively better financial resources too, because those who are really poor, they are in those camps next to Syrian borders, in Jordan, Turkey, Lebanon, or even worse, about 4 million of them are still in Syria, fighting with the conflict and trying to survive. But making it a big crisis, calling it a big crisis or biggest crisis, is a bit unfair. I mean,
dropping by, but we have partly the press is responding to some of the things that the government has been saying today about the refugee crisis. I think we should never forget really the human stories that are at the heart of what is happening really across the region, certainly through Turkey, across Europe as well. And having been to Lesbos and having watched from the northern shore the boats come across, having stood and you look along the shoreline and see a bright orange all along the Lesbos coast, the mountains of life jackets that are piled up for people who have come across on really flimsy dinghies. And what really breaks your heart is as you walk through these mountains of life jackets is to see the armbands and the children's swim jackets, the kind of thing that you might put your child into a swimming pool wearing, and yet that's what children are being given by smugglers in order to make a perilous crossing across the Mediterranean Sea. And to remember too is talking to one of the aid workers in Lesbos who had been working with some of the families who'd been on boats that had gone down, and one child who had lost her sister, I think had drowned, and had been doing some pencil drawings. She showed me, the aid worker showed me some of the pencil drawings that this child had done. And there was one picture which was just heartbreaking of a picture of a boat and a child in the water. But actually what was even more heartbreaking was the second picture that she showed me, which was of what they had left behind, which was of bombs falling on people, and people in just a children's cartoon, people with their heads being cut off and blood everywhere. And that was the experience of a child fleeing from persecution in Syria, fleeing through Turkey, fleeing across the water to Greece, and then having lost family on the journey as well. And I think we should never lose sight of those human stories which are at the heart of what people describe as a refugee crisis now. Look, it's a huge challenge about how we respond, but we also know it is possible to respond. The number of people arriving in Europe last year was around 1 million. That is 0.2% of Europe's population, but it does create huge challenges when it's concentrated in particular countries, when different countries don't have the systems in place to respond, to be able to do asylum checks, to be able to register people, to be able to assess whether people are refugees in fleeing from conflict or whether they have safe homes that they need to return to. It's hugely important that we have a partnership between Europe and Turkey as part of addressing this. We know that Turkey has provided sanctuary already for so many people, so many more people than Europe has done, who have been fleeing persecution on conflict in Syria, but also seeing those who have travelled from Afghanistan and from other countries as well. And it is that partnership working that will be critical, both to preventing the smugglers' gangs who are exploiting people's desperation, to preventing people making dangerous journeys in the first place, but also making sure those who are fleeing conflict get the sanctuary and the humanitarian support that they need as well. And I think it's a sort of final thought. I've talked before about the need, I think, to have both border checks and controls to manage the crisis, and also a system of countries being able to give sanctuary and humanitarian aid as well. But the lesson to us all is that you cannot solve this simply by individual countries operating alone at a time when we know that this is a cross-border crisis, and therefore it is only working in partnership across borders that we will be able to come up with.
Not a pessimistic person, but in this case I really am pessimistic, because not even Germany has managed to speed up European answers and European responses. On the contrary. And this maybe has to do with the structure of the European Union as a whole, because you've got the European institutions on the one hand pushing forward for common solutions. This is the case in the Parliament and the European Commission. And on the one hand, you've got all these member states blocking European solutions, and especially right at the beginning, it were the Visegrad states like Poland, Hungary, Bulgaria, who were blocking a real European answer. And you can see that not even the qualified majority system, which has been used for the first time in migration affairs in the Council some month ago in October, has been useful really. I think we should rely on diplomatic means there, convince and create incentives for all these member states in order to join a common strategy instead of pressing them and putting them more under pressure, which is when they will block more than they have already done.